the imagination of what the job market as a whole looks like is often missing for most people.
India doesn't have a jobs problem. Our unemployment has stayed between 4 and 8% since 1947, right? But employed poverty has been 35%. I don't believe we have poor people. We have people in poor places.
There is no one strategy that's going to work for every country because it's in the context of the country, it's the context of the time.
I'm not sure you can take jobs to people. I think you have to take people to jobs.
How do you see where we are and what we've learned about the skills challenge that India is facing?
India is a much easier place to do business than it was. And we have eliminated some of the difficult stuff. So I think India in the next 25 years, it's an absolutely unique time.
These three issues, which is education being the paradigm we are going, has its own vertical challenges. Skilling, scaffolding that's missing around assessments, and the demand side not signaling enough for us to be in an improper equilibrium.
I think it is all the ideas on the table have the potential for some spontaneous combustion.
Something that I struggle with constantly is just the scale of the problem that we are solving.
There are many kinds of labor market outsiders. Women are one kind. Caste can be another kind. Rural can be another kind. I think we should really now stop kidding ourselves that government schools are unfixable.
Listen, let's create a flexible model of learning that acknowledges that learning happens by doing.
We have to shift apprenticeships from pitching to CSR or pitching to HR head to the CFO.
If there is a way education can pay for itself, that is the model of education India needs. Welcome to Decoding Impact from Satma Knowledge Institute, from your host Rathish Balakrishnan, where we speak to experts, practitioners, and thinkers to help us demystify complex social problems and understand how do we solve these problems at scale systemically. It's very hard to talk about a reality for the whole of India in anything that you take, from jobs to education to health. But I think the one area where it is extremely stark is probably the area of jobs and education. Everyone in a city imagines that this is how the rest of India lives, but the organized sector accounts for only 8% of the whole of India. A large part of India are farmers and construction workers today and are running MSMEs. And the imagination of what the job market as a whole looks like is often missing for most people. And that is crucial for us to have as we think about our roles in policy making, economic choices, and in philanthropy. One person who's been through this job market, both top down and bottom up, is Manish Sabharwal. He's had a chance to orchestrate employment for a large number of people within the Indian job market. He's also served on the largest policy boards across the country, including RBI, in defining what the financial future of this country looks like. Manish has also had a chance to travel across the country, speaking to young people to really know what is the pulse of the country over the last few decades in the job market. So it's great to have you here, Manish, to talk to us about where is India in terms of both jobs and education.
Thank you. Look forward.
Manish, one question that I've always had from people and I've had for people is, how is India's job market doing overall? And as I was telling you, briefly, I was recently at an event in Delhi 2 weeks ago where they were discussing where is India's job market and how is it doing, and they actually disagreed on facts. Which is India's wage increasing over the last decade or is it decreasing? Are we actually seeing more jobs or less jobs? And today, beyond all the numbers and COVID and all of that, it is shrouded in mystery whether economically, as an engine of job creation, is this country doing really well? As somebody who has a very close eye on this, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how are we doing as a country?
I mean, we have obviously, like Tale of Two Cities, it was the best of times and the worst of times. We have a stock problem since 1947 and we have a flow problem since 1991. The stock problem since 1947 is we've still got 42% of our labor force working in agriculture. We've got only 11% of our labor force working in manufacturing. And we probably have 50% people self-employed, but they're not self-employed, they're self-exploiting, right? So what has happened since 1991 on flow? We haven't produced enough manufacturing jobs. We haven't formalized the economy enough. And I think I would be careful with framing this as a jobs problem because India doesn't have a jobs problem. Our unemployment has stayed between 4 and 8% since 1947, right? But employed poverty has been 35%. And I think this distinction is important up front because if you think India has a jobs problem, then you'll throw money from helicopters, you'll mandate a 3-day work week and do some labor laws, or you will take away people's shovels and give them spoons to dig with, right? Because if people are bhuka and pyasa, then you got to really do if the patient is in the ICU, you don't tell them to lose weight or quit smoking. But if then the patient is in the ICU for 50 years, then you've got to sort of think a little bit about, what is the challenge here. And so I would really hope people, and I think now people have shifted the conversation from jobs to wages, right? Because wages is a sign of productivity. It's a sign of productivity of five things. I don't believe we have poor people. We have people in poor places.
Correct.
And in five poor places. One is states. I live in Karnataka. My parents live in UP. Both states have the same GDP, but Karnataka does it with one-fifth the number of people. Cities, if everybody in India lived in Bangalore, then India's GDP would be more than China, right? India's GDP is $2,500. Bangalore's GDP is $12,500. So those are the two geographic places, right? I mean, if an electrician moves from Balasore in Odisha to Lucknow in UP, you get 2 times more salary. You move to Bangalore, you probably get 4 times more salary. You move to Dubai, you get 8 times more salary. But you move to Switzerland, you get 25 times more salary. It's the same damn electrician with the same damn skills. So, beyond the point, the pathology is not at the level of the individual, it is in the external environment. So, if you think states and cities are two places, then the next three are more conceptual, which are which firm you work for, which sector you work in, and which skills you have, right? We all love IT, but IT is 0.8% of India's labor force. It's a rounding error, but we love IT because it's 8% of GDP,
Right.
while agriculture is 42% of the labor force and only 14% of GDP. Right? Firms, if you we finished an exercise with the World Bank a few years ago. If you rank manufacturing companies by size, there's a 24 times difference between the biggest and smallest manufacturing firms. Now, if there's a 24 times difference in productivity, then you'll never pay the wage premium. If
Hmm.
you if you don't pay the wage premium, you'll never be productive. So you get stuck in this low level equilibrium,
Correct.
which in firms shows up in our enterprise stack, right? We have 63 million enterprises, 12 million don't have an office, 12 million work from home, only 1 million pay social security, only 26,500 companies in India have a paid up capital of more than 10 crores.
Hmm.
So 63 million enterprises means nothing if it only translates to that small number at the bottom. And then with skills, I mean, I pay 3 times different salary to a kid the same age with technically the same qualification on paper, right? For feet on street sales jobs. So I think that the notion that wages is a more complex problem. The notion that
Hmm.
wages reflects productivity, because jobs are easy to provide, but do those jobs pull you out of poverty? Is a question
Correct.
that I think too many Indian policymakers have not asked, which is why I think we've oversold fiscal and monetary policy. Right?
Hmm.
If fiscal deficits could make countries rich, why would any country bother being poor? So I think overselling fiscal and monetary policy has been one of our challenges in economics, where you don't structurally take the worm's eye view of the daily life of employers. You're always taking the bird's eye view or the satellite eye view of an employer. So then everything is sort of aggregated to the level. But on a daily basis, the regulatory cholesterol is one of the reasons why India's flow of jobs since 1991 has
Hmm.
not transformed the stock of jobs, right? In the same period, China moved 550 million people from farm to non-farm employment. We still have 200 million people on farms who need to be moved out. We don't need 250 million to 20, 30 million people on farms. We don't need 50% of our labor force to be self employed. That is not some overweighted entrepreneurial gene among Indians. The poor cannot afford to be unemployed, so they are self employed, right? And so much informality is bad for productivity, because informal firms can't attract the talent or the technology or the capital to be productive, right? What is informality in the end? It hurts us at the formal sector and it hurts them in the informal sector. So I think the jobs question should be viewed as the wages question. I
Correct.
think the wages question should be viewed as five ways to drive higher productivity, which is states, cities, sectors, firms, and individuals. And just take and in all these five, the firm one is the most important one, right?
Got
In
it.
some sense, because firm productivity decides wages. I mean, I think the only thing left is regulatory cholesterol. I mean, why have we not converted mass democracy to mass prosperity since 1947? I mean, India has created the world's largest democracy on the infertile soil of the world's most hierarchical society. So, and technically, building a democracy should be harder than building an economy because, building a democracy is not an algorithm. So I think the regulatory cholesterol in my mind is why we have not raised our wages, why we have not built productive firms, why we don't have enough factories.
I have a question here, Manish. I think one, well, by the way, phenomenally comprehensive answer, but one question and one hypothesis I've always carried is that regulation is, of course, the cholesterol, but the way comparable countries in Eastern Asia solve for it is just being a lot more export oriented as a country. A lot of what Korea did, South Korea did actually, and a lot of others did, which are not small countries per se, was to have just a significant export focus and say that, hey, use that as a force to clean up the cholesterol, prepare the design, build the large factories, etc. And we never did that.
Don't you think that was important? The lack of regulatory cholesterol was why they
Hmm.
exported. I think correlation and causation are important to see which one is going where, right? I think that their regulatory cholesterol. I mean, we just did a report last year called "Jailed for Doing Business." There are 26,000 ways for an employer to go to jail in India. Now,
Hmm.
yes, I know there's no CEO in jail, but there should not be 26,000 ways. There shouldn't be 67,000 compliances. There shouldn't be 6,700 filings. So I'm not sure that India has not tried to do manufacturing.
Hmm.
We've just not done it because it's really hard to set up a factory with current labor laws, with current tax laws, with current compliance requirements. I mean, otherwise we go back to the cultural explanation, no, why we didn't do it.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yes, and I think infrastructure and skills have shifted from being a dagger in the heart to a thorn in the flesh.
Hmm.
Infrastructure was a dagger in the heart in the late 90s and 2000s, but we've really invested. It can get better, faster, quicker, but I don't think it's a binding constraint. And skills, I mean, electronic assembly is proving that, Foxconn and others do 8 weeks of training
Right.
classroom and then 8 weeks of on the job. We used to dance with ghosts of do saal lagenge to do an iPhone manufacturer. People are making iPhones in 16 weeks. No,
Hmm.
because most of the technology is embedded in the machines and the processes, and you're just doing assembly. So I think that I acknowledge that skills and infrastructure are important, but they are no
Hmm.
longer the binding constraints. So by elimination, I think regulatory cholesterol explains, because cultural explanations are at best the soft bigotry of low expectations, and at worst they are racism. So I think we have to be honest that yes, I think Indian entrepreneurs have done. I mean, India exported more software than Saudi Arabia did oil in
Yeah.
2020.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
yes, services exports are much smaller than goods export. I mean, and services exports are much more skill intensive than goods
Correct.
exports. I mean, the global services exports are 6 trillion, while goods exports are 26 trillion. So obviously, we should focus on getting 26 trillion. But there's an important difference also in timing, right? I mean, in when Deng Xiaoping, he was very skilled, but he was also very lucky in China. He
Hmm.
got a started opening up in 78. He got a 30-year super cycle, or maybe a 40-year super cycle of global growth, global openness to trade,
Yeah.
and global deconstruction of manufacturing supply chains. That is not the hand India has been dealt in
Hmm.
2024.
I have actually had a chance to talk to a senior bureaucrat who quoted you and your earlier work around regulation, that portal that you had to say, here are all the things that you have to solve, shaking conversations in the government to say, hey, we really have to fix this, right? It's that one moment where they put that report on the desk and say, look at what Manish is saying, we need to fix this. One question is, do you see that shift happening in the government today? Is it more a slow shift, or is it something the government is struggling to sort of solve for given the center state conundrum that we have?
Yeah, see, ease of doing business is now equal to civil service reform, unfortunately, right? And it's not the 6,700 IAS officers, it's the 25 million civil servants,
Right.
right? I mean, even tomorrow, if we got rid of all the filings, compliances, and imprisonments, these 25 million would replicate it within 5 years for three reasons. One is their three philosophies in some sense.
Mm.
Bureaucrats have this thought world of prohibited till permitted,
Yeah.
right? Drunk driving is an argument against cars. So you have to ban cars on the road if there are possibly drunk drivers rather than put the drunk drivers in jail. And the other is bureaucrats tend to be too small for big things and too big for small things.
Mm.
And I know we live in a parliamentary system where technically parliament makes laws, but these criminal provisions are mostly put in by the drafters, and the drafters are all bureaucrats, right?
Correct.
So I think it's very important that we recognize that this steel frame has become a steel cage now. This is not a bureaucracy rant. It is the incentives of bureaucrats, right? They can't choose their own teams. They
Mm.
can't punish or reward their subordinates. They can't pick other than L1 tender, which means they'll have some dhobinai supplying software. But most importantly, in the last 10 years, this corruption thing has meant that anything that goes wrong, we don't distinguish between fraud, incompetence, bad luck, and bad judgment, right? Anything that goes wrong is viewed as fraud. So I think it's important to recognize the incentives of the civil servants and that's why this regulation has become entwined with civil service reform. I don't
Mm.
think you'll be able to make India a fertile habitat for high wage job creation unless we get civil servants to recognize that, of course, there will be private sector chores, but there's also corrupt bureaucrats, there's also goofy politicians. Right? See, everybody has three problems. The government has an execution deficit, the private sector has a trust deficit, and non-profits have a scale deficit.
Scale deficit.
In fact, one of the reasons India is poor is the lack of teamwork, right, between the
Mm.
three. We all climb on a high horse and look upon down upon the other. So I think that this regulation, obviously, there's a center-state conundrum, but Indira Gandhi in 20 of her speeches had said strong states lead to a weak nation. NT Ramarao next morning responded saying the central government is a conceptual myth. Everything that is required to be done for matters for citizens is done by state governments. Life is somewhere in between both of them. You can't do defense in state governments. You need a lot of that. But obviously, medical, health, law and order is in the hands of states. So I think 29 chief ministers matter more than one prime minister, and 200 mayors matter more than 29 chief ministers. So we have only in the last 5 years devolved funds, functions, and functionaries from Delhi, right? For the
Yeah,
first
yeah.
70 years, the central government used to spend more than state governments. It's only now in the last 5 years that state governments went. But now state governments don't want to give money to cities, right? And in India, only 3 or 4% of total government spending is done at the third tier of government. In China,
Mm.
50% of spending and 50% of employment, even in the US, is done by the third tier. In India, the central government spends 48 lakh crores, state government spend 58 lakh crores, 2.5 lakh municipalities and panchayats only spend 4 lakh crores.
Correct.
So I think it's very important for us to recognize that this ease of doing business is a bit of a traffic jam between the three tiers of government. But
Mm.
fundamentally, it's about a tone from the top and a philosophy of saying that yes, there are goofy characters in the private sector, but you can't write the law for those drunk drivers. You do because then you ban cars on the road, and then the whole economy suffers. So I think there's a philosophy shift. There's a power sharing shift to recognize that the people closest to the problem should have the funds, functions, and functionaries, which are power. And the third shift is just to recognize that fiscal and monetary policy won't work, and the worm's eye view of employers is more important than the bird's eye view of employers. So once you make these three shifts, philosophy, sharing of power, and the worm's eye view, I think regulation, and we're making progress. I wish we could do it faster, but maybe that's the fixed costs of democracy. I don't know.
No, I agree. I agree. And I think that, and this is a point that Neelkar Mishra made in the conversation that we had as well, to say, hey, there is no one strategy that's going to work for every country because it's in the context of the country, it's the context of the time. And what is the context of our country and what is the context of the time, I think is very, very important. You spoke about regulation, Manish. I just had one further question before I come back to regulation. You talked about law of the land and you realize, you're right. It's not as bad today, but the place-based prosperity is so stark today. And I was in a different place, and I don't want to name a few weeks ago, and it struck me that economic action is not going to follow unless people feel safe in this place, both in terms of the ownership of their property and in terms of security. Do you think that is still a problem that India has to solve at scale, or do you think that that's on its way to be solved across multiple countries and multiple states?
I think pure law and order security, there will be some conflict zones there, but India overall, the conflict of that kind which we saw in the 50s, 60s,
Mm.
70s is way down. We're on our way to do that. But I'm not sure you can take jobs to people. I think you have to take people to
People to
jobs.
do.
So we don't have a Chinese New Year where 150 million people buy a train ticket for their 4-day weekend in February. on Chhat, Diwali, Eid, or Christmas. We should. Why should every? I mean, it's in political imagination. The whole of India cannot be a fertile soil for job creation.
Hmm.
I think in the short run, I we will have to have more in internal migration. I think we should have more external migration also. I mean, 17 million diaspora sends us $120 billion. We should raise that to 30 million and 300 billion of remittances. So we should send 13 million more. I mean, right now, illegal migration is killing legal migration. But I think a well structured guest worker program is another strategy for India to sort of think about, where we send 13 million people, nurses, truck drivers, teachers, many things for the wage premium, and they come back in 5 years. So there's nothing wrong with that. It's like internal migration. But internal migration between the north and the east and the south and the west has increased, but only in some very clear pockets like Kerala, right? Kerala is now 9.5% Bihari. Um,
Yes.
because they sent 10% to the Middle East, so they brought 9.5% from Bihar. Chhat is already in Bihar. But and you can't be a civil contractor in Chennai unless you speak Hindi. But it's clear that this migration in the short run is happening. It's not
Hmm.
necessarily a good thing. When people in Punjab, the chief minister of Punjab recently told me, wherever you go in the world, I went to Vladivostok and there was a Punjabi there and we are so enterprising. I'm like, your people, nobody wants to live in Vladivostok. They left Punjab because there were no economic opportunities there. This is not all voluntary migration. I mean, much of it is forced because they had to leave. So I think that the question of place-based prosperity, geography, I mean, the world is second best at best. In a first best world, I would take jobs to people. But in
Right.
a second best world, you have to take people to jobs.
People to
And the whole of India doesn't have to get fixed for us to deliver prosperity for the whole of India.
Yeah, and a longer a conversation that and there is sometimes where we move really, really fast, and there are some things that we go glacially slow. And especially when you're in Delhi, it's even more warping because you sort of realize everybody is busy, but nothing is moving, and you wonder why. But coming back, Manish, to the same question around the wages argument and the economic status, what gives you hope? There has been talk about China plus one. There has been a talk about Apple and others increasing their investments in manufacturing in India. Tamil Nadu, for example, really benefiting from some of these investments as well. There have been conversations on STEM. There have been conversations on logistics. As you see the market, what gives you hope around creation of value? Because we've talked about the leaking bucket problem, which is the system has issues. But beyond that, are there trends that are creating greater value for in terms of jobs and wages for us?
I mean, fundamentally, all the other seven problems we have eliminated, right? So, regulatory
Hmm.
cholesterol is flick of pen reforms. See, there are three kinds of reforms. There's capacity building reforms, there's institutional reforms, and there's flick of pen reforms.
Hmm.
Now the capacity building, infrastructure building, NEPs, 15-year glide path on human capital. I mean, there are many improvements in India. India is a much easier place to do business than it was. And
Hmm.
we have eliminated some of the difficult stuff. So I think India in the next 25 years, it's an absolutely unique time. I mean, it will lead. There will be factory refugees. There are 40 of them going around. Only three of them from China have made the leap. Three of them have made the leap right now, Samsung, Apple. But there are 40 more who are ready to make the leap. And they're not choosing India. They're choosing which state to operate in. They've already chosen it.
Hmm. Correct.
And in some sense, so they'll consider Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, and stuff like that. So my sense is we are already on our way to a very different enterprise future. I'm just hoping that if this last round of regulatory cholesterol changes, then we
Hmm.
will be able to accelerate it. I mean, it's important to recognize, despite all the drama and all the noise, investors have made 13 times their money on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we
Exactly.
converted GDP growth to shareholder returns. I think
Hmm.
we can easily convert the GDP growth into wage growth also.
Hmm. And one last question on the demand side before we come to the supply side. We talked about formality a lot, Manish, and I think one of the things that that we've been able to do is to move money digitally, even at a coconut seller level today, which already gives us a digital flow to capital, which we never had. And that sort of is first step to formality, and then on that you enable credit, provide that as a carrot, etc. But are there other ways beyond regulatory hurdle, which is that just don't make it so expensive for somebody to be formal? Are there other things that we need to do to make the Indian market more formal? Because sometimes I wonder whether the ideal state for India is going to be a place where informality continues to exist, but we just manage it better than where we are right now. And I know, your point around informality just being a joke on the cover of the law, but would love to hear your thoughts on that.
See, development is moving from deals to rules, right? As land
Hmm.
purchase. So the transmission losses between how the law is written, interpreted, practiced, and enforced are essentially informality or they are corruption, right? And I
Hmm.
think it's very inefficient for everybody. In India, if you follow a rule, you feel like you missed a deal. No?
Yeah.
You should have called somebody, you should have spoken to somebody. It's very inefficient to look at the rules and then say that, you can't follow them. So, again,
Hmm.
back to my regulatory cholesterol point that in the past, people concluded that the costs of formality were higher than the benefits of formality. And I think GST will change that. A little lower regulatory cholesterol, and people will recognize that formality gives you access to talent, it gives you
Hmm.
access to technology, it gives you access to capital. It just makes you more productive, either as an individual or as an enterprise. And so I think the costs or the benefits of formality were outweighed in the past by the costs of formality. As we reduce regulatory cholesterol, as we digitize, as we do all the stuff, I think urbanize, formalize, industrialize, financialize, and human capital are the vectors that raise wages, right? So if
Hmm.
you so if we do all these four or five, then the benefits of formality. So I think formalization is, I mean, we can't make peace with informality because then you'll always encourage transmission losses between how the law is written, interpreted, practiced, and enforced. And that's just very inefficient for a large country like India. So the more that we make the law as it is written to be as it is practiced, enforced, and that the more efficient it will be for this country. And then that's when you will see the median household income rise. See, per capita GDP is going to rise, but finally, median household income is what should be our metric. And
Absolutely.
that needs us to do all five productivities: productivity of states, productivity of cities, productivity of firms, productivity of sectors, and productivity of individuals. So I think
Absolutely.
formalization is very closely linked to productivity. And the two shock absorbers in our labor market of agricultural employment and informal employment are suddenly no longer acceptable to kids. Actually, nothing has changed in India, but the kids are saying what your self exploitation, which was good enough for their parents or their grandparents, is no longer acceptable to them. So I think this train has left the station anyway. They are not going to accept the Raju Chotu jobs anymore.
Hmm.
And the Raju Chotu job is just the proxy for informal enterprises and informal employment. So I think we should not make peace, with informality, but we must recognize that a large part of informality comes from regulatory cholesterol, which tips over the calculation on formal and informal. I think we have to take the worm's eye view of employers' daily
Yeah.
life and then reduce the costs and raise the benefits. And the superstructure of digital public infrastructure actually improves the returns to formality.
Hmm.
The digital
Hmm.
exhaust that you have from credit, the digital compliance that you have, I mean, you can't hire kids without appointment letters who want loans to buy jobs. And so there's all kinds of sort of drivers of formalization. So I'm quite clear that 63 million enterprises should come down, the number of 1 million social security payers should go up, and the 26,500 companies in India with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores should double or triple in the next.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Let me move this to the fifth lever you talked about, Manish, which is the supply side view we have, which is really the skills question. And you've always said in the past as well, India does not have an employment problem; it has an employability problem. Which is, are we really ensuring that the people have the right skills to sort of, get the right jobs? And as we continue to increase aspirations of people, just the point that you mentioned, the other total jobs are not going to exist, which means that the aspiration gap is, shrinking. On the other hand, recently I was listening to CII roundtable of CEOs before. What did they all said? Listen, our biggest concern as a company today is actually talent. We need way better talent than what we have right now, not just for us but across the value chain. but our skills seem to sort of lack us. And we've done many, many things over the last decades, right? I've seen the entire NSDC curve, Skills University, apprenticeship. How do you see where we are and what we've learned about the skills challenge that India is facing today?
See, the last 20 years have taught us that there's a market failure in skill development. Employers are
Hmm.
not willing to pay for training or candidates, they're willing to pay a premium for trained candidates.
Hmm.
Candidates are not willing to pay for training, they're willing to pay for a job. Banks and microfinance aren't willing to lend to a candidate unless a job is guaranteed. And training companies are unable to fill up their classrooms. So,
Hmm.
while there's been a lot of innovation and action on curriculum, on pedagogy, on teacher training, finally the question is who's going to pay? Everybody's trying to topi pen out the other person. Government wants employers to pay, parents want kids to pay, kids want kids to pay. There are all kinds of sort of everybody's saying who will pay, and this is largely because you can't manufacture your own employees, right? You pay for training. There are three holes in the bucket for an employer. You pay for training, the kid doesn't get a job. You
Right.
pay for training, the kid gets a job but is not productive. You pay for training, the kid gets a job, he's productive, but he leaves.
Right.
So learning risk, attrition risk, and productivity risk means that you're finally sort of screwed with this. But the five design principles that I think we have learned about are
Hmm.
it has to be learning while earning, because in a country like India, stock is as important as flow. Not all parents can pay and not all people working. So it has to be learning while earning. It has to be learning by doing.
Hmm.
You cannot, soft skills are not taught, they are caught. Learning by doing is very important. It has to be learning with qualification modularity. The social signaling value of a degree matters, but only if you keep multiple on ramps and off ramps can you encourage diversity, right? So a 3 month certificate should be an opening balance for a 1 year diploma, should be an opening balance for a 3 year degree, which you can do over a long period of time. You can do a degree in 7 years. You go work, get a diploma, go work, get a certificate, go work, come back. So I think qualification modularity was not there in the past.
Hmm.
You want multimodal delivery, right? Or flexible delivery, because you want an online classroom to be recognized as the same as an on site classroom, to be recognized as an on job classroom, and to be recognized as an on campus classroom. Because otherwise, we traditionally had only one classroom, which was on campus, and it looked like Oxford, Harvard, or IIT, which just doesn't work for skills. And the fifth one is learning with signaling value and employability signaling, not social signaling value. I went to Wharton. Wharton is a good place to be at, but it's a better place to be from. Right? The fundamental value of going to IIT is being from IIT, not at IIT. So I
Right.
think but that's social signaling value, which Michael Spence got his Nobel Prize for. But I'm talking about employer signaling value, right? That a big
Hmm.
may not know how to read and write, so you need signaling value of the certification. So, in my mind, if we implement all these design principles, learning by learning, learning by doing, learning with qualification modularity, learning with flexible delivery, and learning with signaling value, which we are now starting to think about, as NEP also has destroyed the apartheid between education and skills in the
Correct.
past, this big partition between, education and skills. And we must recognize college isn't what it used to be. The world has produced more graduates in the last 400 years, 40 years than the 400 years before that, which
Hmm.
means 60% of taxi drivers in Korea have a college degree, 31% of Walmart checkout clerks have a college degree, 15% of security guards in India have a college degree. But the social signaling value seems to matter of college. So, what we're trying to do in skills by converging it with the higher education system is create that diversity. Now, will these be separate universities? Research universities have a very different thought world than, say,
Hmm.
ability universities. Is skill university a contradiction in terms? It doesn't matter as long as this whole system works together, because I think globally there is a crisis of financing in higher education. Student debt in the US is
Yep.
$1 trillion. Half of it may have to be written off. I mean, the returns to higher education are concentrated in the top 200, 300 universities in the US.
Hmm.
When we talk about endowments, $800 billion in the US, but 50% is with 20 out of the 5,000
Correct.
universities. So I think there's a crisis of financing, there's a crisis of signaling value. For India, we are starting off now. We've just opened up. NEP has allowed 3 foreign universities who have set up. We've now allowed degree apprenticeship. We've allowed a number online learning to slowly start. So I think it's overall there is a good convergence of the three E's of education, employment, and employability. Because what kids are finally looking for is one third college, one third ITI, one third employment exchange. Right? They,
Mm.
they say, give me the social signaling value of college, give me the skills of an ITI, and give me the matching with an employer of the employment exchange. So I
Mm.
think there's now the policy room for innovation for universities, for employers to do this kind of mix and match rather than say that, the employability world is separate from the education world, which is separate. See, the government is organized vertically while this problem is a horizontal. So you need to think about innovation always happens at the intersection. So I think NEP combined with NSQF, combined with many other sort of micro credentialing regulations. I mean, overall, UGC is also recognizing that they can no longer. 20 years ago, the oxygen was rare on the high horse that UGC was, right? I mean, we just used to look down upon the whole world in terms of this world. Degrees are, vocational training is for other people's children. It's
Yeah.
not for our in some
Mm,
sense.
correct.
So now that we are converging the worlds, I think the problem with the last round was there was also not enough on hands-on training, practical training, apprenticeships. I mean, Germany has 2.7% of its labor force. Germany, Austria, Switzerland, these are the three places which have got apprentices right. All of them have between 2.2 and 2.7% of their labor force in apprentices. If we had that number, we would have 15 million apprentices. We have half a million.
Mm.
So I think that the recognition that getting to 15 million apprentices requires connectivity with degrees, requires multimodal delivery has also happened. So obviously we've spent a lot of time, we've done a lot of iterations, but fundamentally, why degree apprentices also matter because they solve the financing problem that I started with. You attract new money from employers. Employers cannot manufacture their own employees. But see,
Mm.
apprentices have a pay for themselves. I can prove to CFOs now. In the past, we used to go to CSR or go to HR for apprentices. Now we go to the CFO because we can prove that apprentices pay for themselves in three ways: higher productivity, faster time to hire, and lower attrition. Because you've taken the kid for a test
Mm.
drive, kid has earned for specific skills by spending time in that, and your productivity and attrition is lower because they already know what they're getting into. So I think that in the next frontier, rising, obviously not everybody will want apprenticeships, not everybody will want in this, but my sense is apprenticeships have, or learning by doing is fun. Even if we don't call it an apprenticeship, most of our learning in life happens by doing. So I think that the skills reboot, which is happening, is partly happening because NEP has created open architecture. Is partly happening because the financing crisis is hitting skills and you want to attract new money. It's partly attracting because the demand side is driving programs rather than the supply side is driving programs. So I think there's a bunch of forces coming together, which I think I don't view the 20 next for the next 25 million factory workers in India. I don't think skills is the binding constraint. For the next
And two
100
questions.
million factory workers in India, we need to do that, and that's why
Yeah.
NEP has a 15-year time.
Right. But two questions here, Matt. Maybe three questions here, Manish. One question is, when you look at the education hierarchy, let's say there are 100 kids between grade 1 to 8 right now. 26 of these kids in India today go to college. But maybe two of the kids today have any signaling value that is of relevance in the ecosystem, right? Like the NIRF ranking, it's really the top 100 colleges that actually can create economic value that can actually shift median and family income. The rest of it is social signaling. Maybe when you're getting a bride may be better, but in the job market, it's not as relevant. And that is an education system that's running for 70 years and so on. Is that a similar challenge in skilling, right? That's one question. Maybe I'll just frame all the three questions so you can answer it together. Maybe they're all connected, which is that the ladder of education is still very, very narrow at the top. It's 2 out of 100 that's getting any sort of signaling value that is financially remunerative. Two is, I think the scaffolding for skilling in general, and in my impression, is broken. Right? Like even to assess skill is a challenge. Like when you talk about recognition of skilling, like if I work, do I know I work well or not? RPL has not really been successful because we've not found ways of assessing whether somebody is skilled or not, as much as somebody can write an exam and prove that they can pass it. And that scaffolding then creates a lot of other issues around how do I recognize skill today, all of that stuff. I think the third problem is, and this maybe is related to the earlier point, so you can ignore it if that's the case. I went to Raipur and once talked to a retail manager and asked him, sir, skill and all of that. He said, bhai sahab, mujhe to gadhe chahiye gode nahi. Right? Like I just need hardworking, low skill, low pay, low retention models of people. And oftentimes that, the flywheel effect you want where industry is demanding talent at the levels that we want often creates the premium for skilling, etc. And sometimes are we stuck in that poor equilibrium because the demand side feels the supply is never going to be sufficient. So I'm going to build a demand that is suboptimal. And the supply side feels, hey, there is no demand signaling, so why am I even spending time doing this? I might as well just go for a job. These three issues, which is education being the paradigm we are going, has its own vertical challenges. Skilling, scaffolding that's missing around assessments, and the demand side not signaling enough for us to be in a improper equilibrium. Do you think they are challenges that we have to solve for?
My favorite book about education is by John Gardner. He was an education secretary in the 1960s. He used to say, can we be equal and excellent? Right? He asked the question that for being equal, we in a democracy, you have to have large volumes, and to be excellent, you have to do small numbers, right? I mean, it's like the IITs and IIMs have tight entry gates and wide open exit gates. Nobody fails. And the chartered accountant exam has wide open entry gates and tight exit gates. 95, 98% of the people fail that exam, right? But vocational training has been wide open entry gate and wide open exit gate. So the signaling value, but that has come from the need to create higher volumes, right? It's like engineering college versus medical college, right? I mean, has the ICT done a good job by taking engineering capacity from 400,000 to 1.9 million, then back to 1.1 million, then back to 1.5 million? India's engineering supply chain is so real time, it's actually quite remarkable. And I think they've done a better job because quantity leads to quality in some sense, right? The journey to quality is through quantity. So my sense is this equal and excellent tension will always be there in a democracy. And let's do it in two different systems. Let's have research universities and let's have, employability universities in some sense. I think finally the only assessment can be done by wage premiums offered by employers. I mean, many countries have tried this recognition of prior learning. You get 40 certificates, but the certificates don't mean much if the employer is not willing to pay the wage premium.
Right.
Wage premium, and we can map out wage premiums pretty quickly now because our recruiting team, we've hired somebody every 5 minutes for the last 20 years, but we've only hired 5% of the kids who came to us for a job. That we're able to sort of think about the wage premium in terms of for this job, for this employer, will this kid work or not? Now, is that as scientific as people would like to make it? I'm not sure. My board exam result was very scientific 25 years ago. So I'm not sure, assessment is always sort of depending on the day, which exams show up, which questions come, how you're feeling. I mean, so let's be careful and a little more humble about a single point in time assessments also, right? And employers are much better at doing that. The final one of sort of thinking about skills versus is much harder, right? Skills versus education. I mean, does supply create demand or does demand create supply? I don't think anybody can answer this question. I mean, it's a chicken and egg problem. The only way to solve a chicken and egg problem is to become vegetarian, do something different, right? So let's do something different here, which is let's do regulatory cholesterol for demand side. Let's build infrastructure. Let's move away from too much puja of fiscal and monetary policy and focus on productivity. And on the supply side, we have a 15-year roadmap for NEP. Let's bring it down to 5 years, yeah, if people want to. I mean, we do, let's, but it is quite clear the problems in the supply side. It's quite clear what are the problems in the demand side. Countries like India don't have to choose between demand and supply, just like we don't have to choose between manufacturing and services. I find the debate insane when people say that India should make up its mind on whether. I mean, that we're not a popcorn stand like Norway or Singapore or Hong Kong or even Korea. I mean, we're a continent. We will do both manufacturing, we will do both services, we will do both domestic consumption, we will do trade, we will do both of them. Because, and that is our strength. So we are not stuck in a low level equilibrium because of some supply side constraint. Electronics assembly, many of the employers, we have supplied 50,000 people in 1 year. How do we do that? I mean, they are fine and they are producing and they are productive, So if the notion was, I mean, at some stage, I feel that if employers are willing to pay the wage premium, see, why is Apple manufacturers paying 30,000 rupees? Because Steve Jobs, genius, he managed to topi pen out people to buy a cell phone for 2 lakhs. No. While the Indian car cell phone sell for 15,000 rupees. So those guys fight with me saying we'll only pay 18,000. So finally, what is the difference between a cell phone guy who says I'll pay 18,000, who pays 30,000? Is the firm productivity, the firm brand, the firm design. So firm productivity really decides where. So Steve Jobs' genius in having design and having branding and makes him you know topi pen out people for a 2 lakh cell phone means that Indian workers get paid 30,000 instead of 17,000, right? So firm productivity, firm is a very important component, and I don't think people in fact informal employers hate being informal because they're continuously recruiting. They're not able to attract capital, they're not able to like take loans, they're continuously harassed by the government. So it's a myth that informal employers like informality. They pragmatically choose informality because they don't have a path out of it. But I think if India decides that, look, we don't want informal, but we don't want to push people into informality by the regulatory cholesterol, then I think Indians will happily embrace formality and our firms will move up to being productive, and self-employment, which is a large chunk of informality, will come down.
I want to just add the question of gender here, Manish. And I think this has caught up a lot of policy imagination conversation. 17% female labor force participation, 21-34 is back down. COVID brought it up and then down. And as a country, it is one of the things that we are telling ourselves is that we need as many smart people as possible to join the workforce. And if 50% of India's workforce is not formally joining the workforce, it's a talent gap that we have to solve for. But a lot of this conversation, like you said, it's stuck in cultural norm conversations often, right? Is it that, hey, do we want the women to work or not? How do you see it?
I mean, I don't. I think cultural explanations are again not fair. I mean, there is no difference. There are many kinds of labor market outsiders. Women are one kind. Caste can be another kind. Rural can be another kind. Is there a difference between a Ministry of Dalit employment and a Ministry of Women's employment?
Mm,
I think both of them, or even rural employment, who want to migrate to cities. All of them suffer from lack of public transport. All of them
mm,
suffer from the wage premium in formal enterprises. All of them suffer from the lack of security sometimes. So, if you do good urbanization, if you do good formalization, if you do good industrialization, if you do good financialization, and you do good human capital, my 5 pillars for raising wages are exactly the same pillars which will raise women's labor force participation. I know that a lot of people have some very women specific labor force participation and interventions in their mind, but they work better as randomized control trials, the pimple on the dimple on the left cheek of the ant, rather than being scalable, replicable, generalizable. I am a little tired of, things which can't be replicated, which can't be scaled, which can't be, they work. I mean, now, all and facts are not data. All anecdotes are facts, of course. I'm not saying they're lying, but facts are not data. So that fact that this worked in this village in this particular thing for 20 people is of no interest at an India level for me. India, why we have solved or why we have done well with digital public infrastructure is because people like Nandan and others solved for population scale calibration, right? And population scale calibration is something that we all in policy, or who's interested in policy or work in policy or work in skills or work in employment, need to calibrate for, because it would be very different to solve a problem for Finland or Singapore than it is for India.
correct.
So I think that I am not convinced yet that a ministry for employment is a good idea, because the
Mm,
Ministry of Employment is 27 ministries. I'm definitely not convinced a ministry for women's employment is different from a Ministry of Employment, which is anyway all the ministries, the role of the government, right?
mm,
I think that women's labor force participation is held back for a variety of plumbing reasons. I think that in the next 20 years, as you see the higher proportion of women who have gone to education come out, you'll see some bump up in that.
right.
Um, I mean, China went from foot binding to 60% labor force participation in one generation. Now, was that something they used to bind women's feet, and now it's 60%? It was just a giant sucking sound from the demand side, right? Which paid a wage premium, which had public transport, and which had formal enterprises with productivity. So I would be careful in cultural explanations for sure. And I think that if we formalize, urbanize, industrialize, financialize, and human capital India, then we will have the labor force participation go up.
Got it. I wanted to come back briefly on the apprenticeship piece, and I know you spoke about it earlier. Personal experience, fully agree. Whatever I learned when I'm doing it.
Yeah.
Whatever I learned got me a job where I learned what I have to learn. I mean, it's really how it works. And the recent announcement of the government, and it's done in a very similar format where they say, "Hey, companies have to enable this and make this happen." You said it's zero point 0.5 at the moment, and we are looking at a number that's closer to 15% of India's people. Are we structuring this right in terms of getting companies to do this? Are there ways to make this work more effectively for young people and for companies?
I mean, the recent schemes don't make it mandatory, they're still voluntary. From 1961 to now, there was a jail provision for not having apprentices. Now, either you should have 15 million apprentices or 5,000 CEOs in jail. We have neither. Threatening people to put people in jail if you don't do it really doesn't work. So you have to make it attractive for people. And I think now people recognize that a well designed apprenticeship program is really self financing. See, we have to
Hmm.
shift apprenticeships from pitching to CSR or pitching to HR head to the CFO to say you have a 12% hurdle rate for your CapEx projects. We can show you a 12%, if not higher return on a well designed apprenticeship program. So I think apprenticeships is an idea whose time has been coming for a long time. Most people don't remember. It was the 20th point in Indira Gandhi's 20-point program in 1975. So
Wow.
we identified it almost 25 years, 50 years ago. But, this is the problem in government, right? One of my biggest questions, maybe you have it too, when you work in policies, how do you get something done in government after everybody who matters in government agrees with you? Right. Yeah. So obviously the government agreed that apprenticeship was a good idea in 1950, but they didn't remove the jail provision. They didn't integrate it with higher education, and they didn't sort of make it easy for employers. And employers started treating apprenticeship act like a labor law, which is a disease like COVID. So you stay away from it. You try and wear a mask. You try and run far away. So all employers have been running away from apprenticeship acts. It's not like COVID. It is an integral part of your people's supply chain, and it will be attractive to kids if you create employer signaling value along with the pathway to learning qualifications. So I think we have finally not reached critical mass, but we have slowly taken away the hurdles in its path. So this 500,000 will go to 2, 3 million soon, and then on our way to 15 million. Can more be done? Absolutely. But I think, it is the future of education, degree apprentice.
Hmm. Hmm.
It is, and globally, I think this employed poverty question means that, full-time learners will no longer overwhelm employed learners.
Yeah.
Because, our parents had 25-year careers, we'll have, or maybe 30-year careers, we'll have 40-year careers, our kids will have 50-year careers. So this upfront learning model of 10 plus 2 plus 3 plus 2 is not going to work anymore. So I think degree apprenticeships with multiple on ramps and off ramps. Actually, India has the chance to innovate at a global level where we have 4 classrooms, online, on site, on job, on campus. We have 3 qualifications: certificate, diploma, degree. We have learning while earning. We prescribe stipends, and companies will keep stipends. We have the signaling value, and we have the learning by doing, mingling with the learning while of theory, with the practical learning with theory learning. So I actually think that because it is also a solution to financing,
Yeah. Yeah.
degree apprenticeships attract new money, right? Teamly
Hmm.
Skills University, the one we run in Gujarat. I mean, I went to Delhi University. Delhi University only gets 2% of its budget from fees. The balance comes from the central government, so 800 crore budget. Teamly Skills University also only gets 2% of its budget from fees, but it gets 98% from employers,
Right.
right? So we are also 800 crores in revenue. We get 98% from them in the Skills University. So I think it's very important to recognize that financing is the challenge for higher education, for skilling now in the future. Obviously, the best way was be for the government to pay for it. But I recognize higher moral claims of school education on government money than on higher education and skills. There might be some claims. So I think we have to figure out new ways of financing education also. And that's why degree apprenticeships, in my mind, are not only a solution to making skilling more demand driven rather than supply driven, they are also a way to attract new financing to the pot.
Manish, I want to take 3 points that you talked about together before I move to the last part of our conversation. One is solving for population scale. We talked about it for DPI. Second is the wider entry gates and the wider exit gates for skilling that is necessary. And the third is the idea of universities and apprenticeships. Something that I struggle with constantly is just the scale of the problem that we are solving. 15 million apprentices. Even if we have the university model scaling, do you really see how? I mean, in the best case scenario, what percentage of young people in India do you see go through the skilling university route to get meaningful economic outcome? Because I think, I mean, from where our baseline is, anything is going to be a progress, right? Like we can do way better than what we're doing right now. But at the best performing stage, 20-25% of young people going through skilling universities, or do you think
I
that could be more?
See, 52% or 60% GER in the US, and 50% of them did a 2 year degree in community college, no, and didn't go on to finish their 4 year degree. So when the US reports GER, it's actually not comparable to our GER, right? So I think that that whole notion of every university is like Oxford or Cambridge or IIT or Harvard is that train has left the station, right? So I think that yes, absolutely, the pathways for kids will be much more diverse, just like
Mhm.
careers for kids are much more diverse than they used to be. Right, the doctor engineer failure train has left the station. So I think that the amount of the economic complexity of India has increased substantially. So just like there are many more professions, there will have to be many more pathways to get into those professions, to signal you're worthy of your professions, or to make yourself worthy of those professions. So I think the skill university, open architecture, multiple classrooms, multiple qualifications is really the future of education globally. So I think that yes, 20-25% of our youth going through this system is going to become the norm in the long run because first of all, it's more inclusive than a traditional university system because kids who don't have money to pay for it. I mean, I chose my parents wisely, so I went to Mayo and Sri Ram and Wharton. So, I mean, I recognize that most people. I was born on the 10th floor, and it's just not fair to have university systems which cost so much. And Bill Baumol got his disease. You know, his research was on the cost disease, right? Where productivity and education can't go up as fast as the costs go up. And that's why US higher education is becoming almost unaffordable for most people, right? So and they talk about scholarships, but it's a really hard thing to do. See, a great university is low fees and high costs. Most people don't realize that. It's a how do you square that circle? You
Yeah.
have to have low cost to be inclusive. So I think that the mm, changing the way there will be research universities with the 5, 10, 15, 20,000 students, but you'll have these skill universities with hundreds of thousands of students, not all full time, not all on campus, and not all doing a degree, but working towards it.
Do you think that design will still meet the need of the skill that we have in India today, Manish? Or do you think because I mean, as you're speaking, I feel like that still will help make sure that the topsoil is not just 2%; it's more than 40%. But will that still hit as far as we need to for population scale?
I mean, you can only sort of innovate as far as you can see. I think once we turn this corner, we'll see around the corner. No.
Got
See,
it.
again, just like thinking about development as learning by doing, I mean, we have learned a lot about apprenticeships and skills and online, what works, what doesn't work. So I think once we have this model embedded, that will become the ground floor for building the second floor and third floor on top of it, right? I mean, so I think, yes, I think, did China innovate massively in skill development? I don't think so. They innovated massively in creating factory jobs, which sucked people out, and they taught them by learning and put them on the factory floor. So hopefully, we will pass a little different path than China. But
Got it.
I think it is all the ideas on the table have the potential for some spontaneous combustion, There will be other business models. There will be some non-profit models. There will be government innovation. So I actually believe that yes, I'm back to my skills is not the binding constraint for growth right now.
The last section that I wanted to speak to you about is really education, because a lot of times I feel like we, rather than building on the coattails of good education, we are fitting band-aids into a proper, a faulty education model, and then figuring out ways to make people productive and realize their human potential. And while the North Star for primary education is clear, which is that a child has to be able to, learn, write, and read, and do some maths, we are not so clear about what children have to do after they hit, seventh or eighth grade right now. And there is really no vision for what we have to do as a country. And I think the NEP sets a path in terms of bringing skills and education together. That's a good starting point. But how do you see it, Manish? Because as you once said, you are at the exit gates of education today. And are we sort of setting ourselves up at that exit gate for the kids to have a meaningful future? And what should be done differently?
Yeah, see, the most embarrassing number about India is only 45% of kids left in government schools. Right?
Hmm.
Only 5% of kids are in private school in Japan, only 10% in UK, only 15% in the US. So I think if anything should be free and at quality, it should be K-12 education. But because we lost all these years in government schools because we equated school reform with higher teacher salaries, higher teacher
Hmm.
qualifications, and smaller class sizes. Turns out, yes, they help in a randomized control trial kind of low ambition way, but they don't really change the needle on an aggregate basis because the two things of governance and performance management, right? What is performance management? A fear of falling and a hope of rising. We have completely shied away from doing that. We even hesitate to do a transfer policy, and governance is allocation of decision rights on what the principal has actually has. So I think unless we get government schools right, in the repair, prepare, and upgrade continuum, prepare is very important. I mean, I think sometimes the school premium may be more important in wages than the skill premium. The
Right.
reading, the 3 hours of reading, writing, and arithmetic with the fourth hour of relationships, if we want to add it, soft skills. You had him for 12 years, man. हमको काहे को बोल रहा है? तीन महीने में we can't teach people English. It's just K-12. You had him for 12 years and teach her how to read, write, and arithmetic. I'll teach her how to be an electrician or a salesperson, yeah, in 3 months. But I can't teach her how to read, write, and do math. And now that's what most employers are looking for at the bottom of the pyramid because technology has taken tacit knowledge and codified it and embedded it into machines. It's embedded it into processes. So actually, for bottom of the skill electronic assembly jobs, most of the knowledge has now been embedded in the machine or in the process.
Right.
So you can actually get away with a 12th class degree and make an iPhone in some sense because you're being supported by all these machines and processes, right? And that's really what happened in China. So I think that the education system of schools, private, I mean, this is not an argument against private schools. I shudder to think what we would have done without the private sector response to schooling, that 55%. But I think we should really now stop, kidding ourselves that government schools are unfixable.
Hmm.
Political economy of government schools has been tough, but it is just shameful that chief ministers would not crack a whip on government schools and get government outcomes up there. So if you don't fix school education, then in government schools where education should be free and it should be at quality, and then have the private schools to it separately, which is anyways happening, and there's multiple tiers and multiple fee points. But again, like a great university's low fees, high costs, schools don't know how to do endowments, don't know how to do scholarships as much as universities can do it, right?
Hmm.
Universities have this proven model of attracting resources for capex, so you don't close feed with capex, you do endowment. But in schools, that's much harder. And so I because alumni also are sort of differently in modes of giving. They're at different stages of life. So there's all kinds of ways that I think the endowment scholarship cross subsidy model that universities can adopt to be more inclusive doesn't apply to schools. And if we
Hmm.
don't fix K-12, we don't fix our human capital problem
Yeah.
because repair and upgrade cannot do what prepare is supposed to.
Absolutely. And if I had to ask you, Manish, when a 15-year-old gets out of school or at a 17 gets out of school, when he reaches you, what are some things that we should absolutely make sure we do for every Indian child?
I mean, reading, writing, arithmetic, and relationships, right? The soft
Mm.
skills of, telling them to shave and take a bath and tuck their shirt in is as important as them knowing how to do compound interest, or not even compound interest, forget it, that's too much. Just do reading, writing, and arithmetic in the traditional way. That's why I am a little against vocationalization of school education. Because
Mm.
class 10 has become the new class 8, class 12 has become the new class 10. Schools should just teach kids literacy, numeracy, soft skills, reading, make reading a habit for them. If you're not reading by grade 4, I mean, before grade 4, you're learning how to read. But if you haven't learned how to read by grade 4, then after grade 4, you're reading to learn. So you just get left behind, right? Because learning to read was hygiene, but reading to learn is no longer hygiene. You just get left behind. So I think schools should be schools. They should teach them these things of the 3 hours and the fourth hour, which is a 21st century relationship, soft skills, life skill, whatever you want to call it. And I think schools are a good place for that, teamwork, sports, music. I mean,
Yep.
all the other stuff is important to teach kids, teaches kids soft skills in ways that, very often you can't do in soft skills classes at the exit gate of the school system. Teamwork is better taught by sports than by um, exercises in a classroom, or answering questions. So I think that if schools are able to deliver the 4 hours, we will figure out what to do with them after that. And then some of them will go to college. Should everybody go to college? I think India will not do what Singapore does, which is you get a letter in class 8 saying you're good with your hands and they stream you into the vocational system. I mean, I was a late starter. I would have got streamed out of college, then I wouldn't have been where I am. No. So I am not a big believer in streaming or binning kids too early, because many people are late starters. So should everybody go to college? Should be answered by, let different kinds of college be available, at the exit gate. But everybody should do class 12, and everybody should get, even a security guard, even an electrician now requires you to be literate, requires you to be numerate, requires you to be soft skills. So we should just make universal class 12 with learning outcomes. And I used to never go for the Asar report because it was too depressing for 20 years. This year I agreed to launch it for Rukmini because more kids are in school with more years of schooling, with better learning outcomes and massive digital connectivity. For the first time, her report is fun to read. It's not sad to read. It's hopeful to read, and I think that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Manish, at the end of every episode, I try and summarize. I don't know if I'm going to even be able to do that with the amount of ground we've covered. And for the first time, I have a guest who speaks faster than me. So it's actually good to have someone on the podcast who, has so many numbers. And I've enjoyed all our conversations. But let me take an effort in summarizing what I took away from the conversation. I think to always see poverty as a problem of the person is the biggest mistake we can make. And there are 5 levers that you talked about, which is really state and the city, and then sector, firm, and individual. And how do we sort of look at these 5 levers, and the firm being probably the lever that has the highest returns today for us to be able to solve for. And in the firm level, by just the process of elimination, like Sherlock Holmes would love to do, the only thing that is left is probably the right answer, and regulatory cholesterol is the problem to solve. And because and what appealed to me in that conversation is sometimes we make it about 15 things to say, hey, if this is the biggest constraint, solving for this is going to become most important. And I think, as you rightly said, solving for this is not a problem of just changing the norms. It's probably civil services reform. It's that, are we putting people who have the right incentives to solve problems at the right places, and are we putting them at the right size for them to get out of the way when they know they have to? I think is important. You also highlighted the fact that, hey, listen, while regulatory reform is a problem to solve, it's not something that has to pull us down, because we have actually given 13 times shareholder returns for us. For as a country, we have invited people. People are choosing states, not countries inside India anymore. We are showing in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu that investments is resulting in commensurate returns. And I think the point that you made, and coming from you, for me, this was an important lesson that skilling is not the binding constraint. Let's not shoot ourselves on saying, no, no, we don't have skilled people, because in 16 weeks, people are actually making iPhones and it's actually working. And I think the demand side sucking sound will take care of people navigating and making that happen. On the supply side, I think the point that you mentioned in sort of saying that, listen, let's create a flexible model of learning that acknowledges that learning happens by doing this. Probably not one way, one model, one structure to be able to do this. And for the country of India's size, solving for population scale through the right flexibility is going to be super, super important. Will it help every Indian? We get as far as we can go and we learn from it. And I think that's the only way to do this. We cross the river by feeling the stones. And we have to start crossing the river at this moment. And I think the other point that you made that I'm sure is going to start a lot of conversations inside my own organization is the question of gender, which is that exclusion comes in many forms. It comes in the form of the place you belong to, which is rural, your cultural identity, which is caste, and your sex. And each of them do have constraints, but is there a way we can solve for this problem by Ministry of Women Employment? Maybe not. What we have to solve for is the same five things that you talked about and reduce the frictions in the system from transportation to mobility to internal migration to that, so that if the demand is strong enough, if the friction is less enough, people make rational choices to improve their economic outcomes, then women will get to work, just like how villages in China went from binding the women's feet to getting them to jobs at 60%. Right. And I think the last thing that we talked about is the apprenticeship. And I think we didn't touch about this enough just because I was watching the clock, but we can't solve for skilling in education unless we bring new money into this model. And one part of that money is philanthropy, one part of it is endowment, one part of it is government's funding. But if there is a way education can pay for itself, that is the model of education India needs, because we have limited capital. And how we solve for it is important. And hence, apprenticeship gives us a way of financially sustainable models of enabling people have enough credentials that can get them jobs, and for companies to find ways of integrating it because it is not a bottom line issue for them. And doing that at scale is an idea whose time has been coming. It's probably right now that it's going to come. And the last part that you mentioned is that we can't solve for 12 years of education in 3 months of a program, right? What skilling universities have to sort of focus on is to make somebody an electrician, not make somebody literate, numerate, or a good human being. All of those things that we have to do, which is literacy, numeracy, and relationships, is going to come from school environments that don't have to focus on vocationalization, but just have to focus on getting a child to read, getting a child to engage with other people, getting a child to recognize that there's a human potential that they can unlock through fundamental aspects, and making 12th grade education mandatory with good learning outcomes is probably the goal that we have to fight for. And we should stop giving ourselves excuses that we can't fix this problem and wait for it to become politically salient, because this is a fundamental engine of growth that every state will need for them to thrive, and so on. And so I hope I did a decent job of all the insights that you covered. Manish, thank you so much for your time. Very, very useful conversation. As always, enlightening speaking to you. And at some point, I hope we can come back again and ask ourselves if needle shifted some significantly more between our two conversations.
Yes, the summary was better than the original.
That's hard to believe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Decoding Impact. I am your host, Rathish Balakrishnan. If you liked what you heard, head over to Satpa Knowledge Institute, because we have a lot more content there on education and many other topics. Also, check out Decoding Impact Season 1, 2, and 3 on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you hear your podcast from.